Hi, I'm Dr. Sadie Larson, clinical psychologist and member of the ISTSS Public Information and Education Production Subcommittee. One of the goals of ISTSS is to disseminate high-quality knowledge and education to improve access to quality care for people who experience trauma. As part of that goal, the ISTSS Production Subcommittee is collaborating with developers of the interventions that were highlighted in the ISTSS Adult Prevention and Treatment Guidelines to support widespread implementation and dissemination of those recommended interventions among ISTSS members and the general public. So today I'd like to welcome Patricia Resick, who developed cognitive processing therapy, which was identified as a psychological treatment intervention with a strong recommendation in that guideline. So thank you so much for being here today. Would you like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. You've already done it, Patricia Resick. I am now officially Professor Emeritus, which means I retired in January 1st of this year, and at Duke University Medical School. And that doesn't mean I'm not working as much as I was before, but I'm officially retired.
Yeah, excellent. So we'll just start with cognitive processing therapy, and what are the specific goals and what would you say are the key components of the intervention?
Um, the key components to start with is that it's primarily a cognitive therapy. We have a couple of behavioral assignments at the end of if you did it in 12 sessions. There's lots of variations on CPT now. I think of the goal is to teach people how to think differently about their trauma, that something got them stuck, some idea about why it happened. And then because of what they thought about why it happened, it affects how they think about themselves and the world in the current and the future. So we go back to the trauma, untangle that, figure out what they've been saying to themselves, teach them how to look at it differently, explore different pieces of evidence about the event, and ultimately the goal is to get them to become their own cognitive therapist.
Yeah,
So they can do this in other areas of their life and with other traumas.
excellent. And would you say that there is a specific target population for this intervention?
PTSD. um, we've used it with men, women, civilians, military, foreign countries, adolescents. So we just keep trying it with different populations. We haven't done it with young children, but there are other therapies that are similar for young children.
So a better question might be, who wouldn't be appropriate for CPT?
We've tried, right from the beginning when we did the very first research on it, we tried to leave in as many people as possible. We didn't want it to be an ivory tower therapy. So we didn't rule out anything except for really active emergency type problems like not suicidal ideation, because that would rule everybody out. Suicidal intent, homicidal intent, active psychosis, meaning that if they were medicated and they were stable, we let them in the studies. If they needed, we've even changed that over time, but in the beginning, if they had to detox, we ruled them out until they were kind of stably off their substance abuse. We've not been ruling that out. So usually it's just like, are you going to be available until we finish the therapy?
Right. Right.
We've never ruled out manic depression, the bipolar disorders. If they're stable on their medication, we're good to go.
Yeah. So very broadly applicable.
Yes.
Yeah. And how do you measure treatment outcomes to determine if this is having the desired effect?
Well, like most, it depends on if you're doing research or if you're doing clinical work. In research, we use these days we use the CAPS. We have used NFOA's PSSI in past research, but now we have the CAPS for DSM-5. We use that, but we also measure people every week. so that we are using the PCL5. And so we monitor that, and a lot of our analyses, we want to see how they're changing over time. One of the studies found out that about a third of the dropouts, and we've seen that across a couple of studies, had gotten to a good end state. It's like they didn't care I was doing research, like I quit. But we looked at because we were testing them weekly, we could see that they had actually gotten to a good end state and they were done, regardless of the fact that we were doing research. We usually measure depression. Not about half of people have a major depressive disorder, so we tend to use that as well. The other half don't. If they have some other kind of disorder, substance abuse, eating disorders, whatever it would happen to be as a comorbid disorder, anxiety disorders, we would probably want to include those kinds of self-report measures as well.
Mhm. So starting with the PTSD and depression and then expanding as relevant for that particular patient in front of you.
Exactly. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
And it sounds like the weekly measuring of symptom change is an important part of it too, to really get a sense of how people are doing, not just at the end of treatment, but how are they doing as they go along?
Well, and we've really moved away from doing a set 12 sessions. We've got enough research now that personalizing the length of therapy, that's what we're calling it in this new manual coming out, is it could be called variable length or flexible length, but we've been calling it personalized length of therapy. Some people don't need 12 sessions and you're trying to drag them in there till the end. That's when they tend to go missing. Some people need more. And the question often comes up, should we change therapies? And very often the answer is no, they just need a few more sessions. And it's a matter of figuring out where are they still stuck? What is keeping them from finishing the recovery? So we've gone, one study we did with active duty military up to 24 sessions. Nobody ever got that far and got to good end state. Usually it was in the early 20s, like maybe 20 sessions, they get to a good end state. But beyond that, they tended not to. So you got to figure out then at that point, what do you do?
And so if you had to say at this point, rather than saying this is a 12 session treatment, what would the range be that you would say?
It's anything from 5 to 18 to 20.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so a lot bigger range than
Oh yeah,
when
we've
it was
had people
first developed.
Yeah, we've had people that just like immediately they had like one major key lynch. I think of it as a linchpin stuck point, and that gets resolved. And they were like, "Oh, it wasn't my fault." Well, if that means that, then this means that, and you can just see it all shifting. So sometimes it just doesn't take very long. Some people have gotten very convoluted in their thinking and hang on to some of their stuck points, and they take a little bit longer, particularly if they had child abuse, child sexual abuse, and they've had those thoughts or those images in their heads for many years.
Yeah, makes sense. And so as you've worked to expand access to new populations, how have you thought about the balance of fidelity and cultural adaptation?
Well, I mean, when we first started disseminating it, there were other people that started disseminating very quickly into different populations. I mean, Western Europe, there didn't need to be much adaptation. Germany or I just did some work in Amsterdam. You don't need much adaptation. In fact, sometimes you don't even need to change the language on it. But Judy Bass some time ago went into the Democratic Republic of Congo and did an actual RCT with 100 women, and they were able to do it without paper, pencil, training therapists who didn't have a high level of education. So the nice thing is that we're not basing it on a culture. We're basing it on what they say. And so what's keeping them stuck? And so sometimes culture is taken into account. Deb Kaysen has done some studies, like when she worked with Native Americans up in Washington State. So they were working on treating not just PTSD, but substance use disorder and HIV risk. And they did include some of the cultural things, and they changed some of the worksheets. They had the final worksheet, which used to be called the Challenging Beliefs Worksheet. As of April, it'll be called the Alternative Thoughts Worksheet. They had it shaped like a mountain. It was wonderful. So you started with the ABC sheet at the bottom and then worked your way up to the top of a mountain. It's a much lovelier worksheet than our little grid.
Yeah.
But yeah, they can take into account cultural beliefs and so forth, because that's just part of who people are. Just like, and culture can mean lots of things. It can be military culture, it can be religion, it can be the culture of other languages, in other countries. There's an RCT that's being written up as the first RCT coming out of Japan. They did really well with it, better than I see in the US. Very low dropout rates, they're very compliant, and they really like this CPT. So, we had one pilot study that Tracy Clemens did in Cambodia with a group of adolescents who had been victims of slave trade and sexual trade, and they did really well with it. So, I mean, so far the CPT is a structure, and we're being Socratic. We're asking them questions, so they're telling us how they think. We're not imposing any beliefs on them. We're just trying to help them get unstuck from blaming themselves, from saying everyone is dangerous, from extreme thoughts to more balanced thoughts. So, I mean, it doesn't matter what the thoughts are. We're trying to move to more factual basis and something that they're going to feel better about. That the extreme emotions can become more balanced as well, and that they can then feel the natural emotions.
Yeah, well, and it sounds like there's a lot of room when needed to change the kind of specifics, as long as you're keeping that general structure and kind of spirit.
Yeah, and the general structure is that we had laid out all these worksheets because we were trying to systematically teach people to think differently. So, like, what's the difference between an event and a thought? Like an event and a feeling, and if you change your thought, do you change your feeling? How does that feel then? So we start with that, and then we start asking them the Socratic questions to help them fill in the picture of what actually happened to them. And help them see that maybe they couldn't have changed the outcome. Then maybe they have to accept that it wasn't their fault, that it happened in spite of them, not because of them. And try to get rid of shame and blame and some of those kinds of things. And then move into how that affects their beliefs about themselves and the world. But it's very kind of a systematic process, so we're not overwhelming them with the final worksheet at once.
Yeah. And so if you were a clinician wanting to start using CPT, or a system wanting to start to implement this, what resources or training do you think are required to really implement this well?
We are finding out that people really do need case consultation to begin with. A lot of people are not trained in good Socratic questioning, and they get too pushy. They figure out why that person is stuck, and they want to kind of insist, or try to say it's not your fault, and they'll just say you don't know what you're saying. You weren't there. How do you know? So we have to really teach people to kind of be quietly patient in asking questions and being Socratic, and that takes some consultation typically, because most schools do not teach it very well. So, I mean, we typically recommend a 2-day workshop. There is an online course, but that's almost like a refresher, or do that before you go to the workshop. So we're not having to say, here's an ABC sheet, here's A, here's B, here's C. They've seen it. So we can just go right in and talk about how you use it. So we want a 2-day workshop if they're going to do individual. If they want to do group, we would recommend a 3rd day. Sometimes whole agencies will bring in a trainer to do the workshop. And then we follow that up with, excuse me, about 20 sessions, six months maybe of case consultation. And that's done group and typically online where we can see everybody and they can all discuss cases. So they're learning not just from their own, but they're learning from other people's cases as well. And then they have to turn in the summaries on 2 cases. And then if they want to be considered a quality rated provider, we actually will have them send in audio or videotape so we can then do ratings on their therapy. They can, if they finish 2 cases and turn in their case summary and they've been attending the case consultation, they get on our roster. And that's cptforptsd.com. We have a roster that people can, and that means that they're actually available to do therapy. We don't have researchers put their names on there because if they're not going to take cases, then why be on the roster? And this is their license. They've been through the training, they've been through the consultation, and that it's possible for somebody to search. So we've got a number of countries that are listed. They can search by country, by city, or state, and even down to zip code. Although with so many states allowing licensure across states, it's possible to find somebody who may be 1,000 miles away and can do it on telehealth.
That's a good point. That is changing now.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but that makes sense that, I mean, having been through some of that consultation myself, I think it's helpful to get into the weeds of an actual person and some of the complications that come up and being able to work through those with that consultation.
Right. You can't have every single example on an online course or in the manual.
Yeah.
Bound to be, they're going to come up with their own way of avoiding or their own answer to a question that you answer, and you kind of go, what? Now what?
Yeah.
And the problem is if you've been trained in some other kind of therapy, your tendency is if you get stuck is to fall back on your old way of doing therapy instead of getting the consultation.
All right. So when you think about the sustainability of this intervention, and there's been a long history of research at this point, what things do you think are necessary to ensure the sustainability of it, again, in an organization or with a patient?
Well, I think having ongoing case consultation within a group or an organization is helpful. So if they can meet periodically to make sure you're not like meandering off, because I've seen people who've come back to a second workshop and said, I realize I've been drifting, So, or doing the fidelity worksheets on themselves, or recording and having somebody else that listen to your tape and saying, am I on key here? Also, I think an important thing is just watching. That's why the ongoing assessment is so important. If their scores aren't coming down, you want to know why. So have you wandered off into another territory? Are they not doing their practice assignments and you're letting them get away with doing just one a week? One of the things that I've never been happy about is that the VA allows 1 session a week. In fact, that's what they want. And ever since the beginning, since I first started doing this in 1994, we always did 2 sessions a week. And Cassidy Guttner did a research on that with the first 2 studies and found out that the fewer days between sessions, the better the outcomes, which has also led us now into doing CPT as fast as possible. 3 weeks, then 2 weeks. Now we've tested it with 1 week. So if people can take 1 week of vacation or sick leave, they could get treated in a week. And that drops that reduces the dropout rate and doesn't seem to reduce the effectiveness. So, we need to get longer term follow-ups with those and more RCTs. There's only 1 RCT that hasn't been written up yet. Doing it in 1 week. It was a combination of group and individual that was done at Fort Belvoir with Jen Watchin, but she's in the process of writing that up. So there's been a lot of case studies and case series that have been done with both military and veterans, and they're using it in the VA now in some places. And there's even some private practitioners who are using nothing but 1 week CPT and filling their caseloads. And at the end of a week, they, like they have somebody come in the morning, and then go do 3 worksheets, come back in the afternoon, or do it on telehealth. And then they can see another person at the end of the week. They've gotten a whole nother caseload.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, just other innovations in kind of how we deliver this in ways that are more practical for people, more accessible.
That's what we're trying to get to, is something that's going to reduce drop. The longer you drag it out, the more likely you are to get dropout, and then they're going to feel like a failure. This didn't work for me. When in fact it may have been that it just dragged on too long, and they were always playing catch up. Like, what's been going on for the last month since you were on vacation?
Right.
So if you can do it quickly, then there's less time in between times for them to fall back, more likely to get their practice assignments. I mean, need to do a little research on that. That's going to be one of the secondary papers, is like, if you do it in a week versus 6 weeks, do you get as much practice assignment? Because we know doing those worksheets really makes a difference. Just like getting case consultation makes a difference. We're finding out things that improve therapy outcomes and reduce dropout.
That'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is around ways that implementation has changed since the initial development, and we've already touched on some of the big ones. I guess, are there any other things that you would mention in terms of the way that this has changed over time?
Well, I think the use of the telehealth has changed things rather dramatically. And we did a study down in as part of the Strong Start Consortium down in Texas, and I think telehealth might be our sweet spot. The highest dropout rates are when they have to come into therapy to do in person. I know therapists love it, but that's 3 hours out of somebody's day, and if they do it twice a week, that's 6 hours of, driving to, finding parking, paying for parking, getting to the therapist's office. If they could just turn on their tablet or their computer and they're in their therapy session, lower dropout rate. Results are just as good. The other one that worked really well and had a low dropout rate was in home, but that's not, except for some cases in the VA, that may not be a viable solution. It's been done before. I mean, we did it back in the early 2000s with Bosnian refugees who were settling into St. Louis, and they couldn't leave their houses. So there was actually funding for a therapist or therapists to go to their homes and do the CPT there. So that was probably the first in-home study of although it wasn't an RCT, they did collect the data because they were giving it to them regularly.
So just a lot of ways of thinking outside the box in terms of how we get this to people.
Yeah, and if people are disabled, can't drive, elderly, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why, too far away. There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to adapt, either going to them or doing the telehealth.
Yeah, certainly a lot more telehealth these days.
Well, there is, and even telehealth group CPT. One of the interesting findings we had not that long ago, within the last 2 years, that people aren't aware of it. I finally got to compare group, which is how I originally developed CPT, with individual, and it looked like individual worked better than group. But when they looked at, Jen Watson took the lead on this secondary paper, when they looked at traumatic brain injury, these were all active duty military. At least half of them had not just a head injury, but 70% of those had ongoing symptoms, dizziness, problems with concentration. They had trouble doing group, and they actually completely accounted for the difference between group and individual. Those without a head injury did equally well with group and individual. Those with a head injury did really well with individual. They actually did better with individual than the ones without a head injury, but they did really poorly with group. So that's a place for screening. If you're working with battered women and they have head injuries and many concussions, individuals the way to go, not putting them into a group. Same thing with car accidents. So it's not just military, it's all sorts of people that might have head injury would need individual treatment. But if you don't have that stuff, group is a great way to go. Works just as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I'll just ask if you have any last kind of advice for people thinking about using this, lessons that you've learned that you think are important.
Well, one thing I just wanted to let people know about, it just came out in April. Right now, we have a huge backlog in this country of people who need treatment for PTSD. And Shannon Wilsey Sturman and Stephanie Lasavia and I wrote a self-help book based on CPT. So that's actually out there and available. It's easily purchased through Amazon or through Guilford. So sometimes therapists are having them use that while they're on the waiting list. Or somebody who can't get to a therapist, who doesn't want to get to a therapist, can try the self-help book. So I do want to put in a plug for that because we're getting very good reviews on it. In fact, we've already sold out of the first printing and they're in the process of doing a second printing on it just since April. And the new edition of the therapist manual that was first published in, more generic, not the military one, but the generic one was came out in 2017. So it was time for an update. We changed a lot of the language in there. So I recommend people take a look at that. It matches the self-help book. So we got the worksheets to match. So I've been wanting to change it for a while and hadn't gotten to it. We've been using the word challenge too much. Challenging beliefs worksheet, challenging questions. That's ripe for misunderstanding. It sounds like an argument, that yeah. So we've softened the language completely. It's exploring questions, and they're not faulty thinking patterns, they're thinking patterns.
Yeah.
and alternative thoughts worksheet. So we ABC sheet is still ABC sheet. There's nothing particularly challenging about that, but we've softened the language, got rid of the word challenge. We have a whole chapter on case conceptualization to help people kind of figure out where they're going to start heading with a particular client with particular comorbidities and stuck points and history and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot in that update.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and give us kind of the whirlwind overview of CPT and the many ways that it's been disseminated and implemented over time. It was a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.